Education at the First Unitarian Church of Rochester. Our Gould lecturer once wrote about her discernment process to be a minister of religious education using this image. It felt like the kind of choice you have when you come to a sign that says, "All traffic exit here." Sure, you can ignore it and take off across the fields if your car can handle it, but that's doing it the hard way, and it probably won't get you anywhere you want to go. Life is going another way, the way the sign is pointing, and the only life-affirming choice is to say yes to it. And so she said yes to her calling that week in 1989, and here she is, a very well-known, well-loved mentor, colleague, and steady force of religious leadership among us, the Reverend Frances Manley. Fran has served mostly in the western portion of our region, beginning with a 7-year position as Director of Religious Education at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Buffalo. She attained her Master's of Divinity from Meadville Lombard Theological School in the Modified Residency Program for Ministry of Religious Education in 1997, and served as the program's interim director shortly thereafter. Reverend Frances has served as part-time minister at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Niagara at 2 different times, from 1996 to 2008, when she became the Minister Emeritus. She has also been the consulting minister to our Hamburg Unitarian Universalist Church from 2006 to 2013. Our roads first converged when she was the Queen of the Renaissance program, providing education for religious professionals from 2000 to 2004. Other denominational activities included a multitude of roles serving our former St. Lawrence district, the Religious Education Committee, being a program consultant for the Planning Committee, being president of the St. Lawrence Foundation, being on the Commissioned Lay Leader Committee, and now Council, serving as a trustee, and the Youth Adult Committee. She also was consulting minister for our former Ethos Leadership School and on the Liberal Religious Educators Board. Special to my heart is Fran's role as coordinator and contributor for the historic Essex Conversations in Religious Education. She has won awards for adult worship, biblical studies, and a prize in the philosophy of religion. Since her retirement from active ministry in 2008, Fran has been a member of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Buffalo, where she sings in the choir, serves on the Worship Associates ministry team, and provides pulpit supply for our upstate congregations. She has been married since 1962 to retired scientist Kenneth Manley, who's here today, with 2 married sons, Jonathan and Christopher, and 5 grandchildren. Her journey continues to enrich and lead us forward, children, youth, and adults alike. Many here would not be the same without her saying yes to her road that has proven to be long, winding, full of wit, wonder, and abiding commitment to all of us. It is my honor and great privilege to introduce to you our 2019 Gould lecturer, the Reverend Frances Manley.
I can see you and you can see me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Sometimes timing is everything. One afternoon, a little over a year ago, I received an email from a beloved colleague inviting me to do what I am about to do right now, deliver the annual Josephine Gould Discourse at this gathering. To tell you the truth, if that email had arrived a few days earlier, I'm not sure what would have happened. I was 10 years into retirement, and no longer doing very much active ministry. I was certainly not keeping up as thoroughly as I might with all the latest movements and issues in our association. And whatever I might have been passionate enough about to want to share it with you 10 years ago or 15 or 20 was feeling like old news. In truth, I was feeling a little bit past my sell-by date. So I might well have been inclined to say, thanks for asking me. I really appreciate the honor, but no thanks. I don't think I have a discourse in me. At best, I would probably have asked for a little time to think it over to see if I could talk myself into it. But as I said, sometimes timing is everything. The date was March 24th, 2018. And at the moment when that email showed up in my inbox, I was sitting with my laptop, glued to the live stream of the March for Our Lives in Washington, D.C., watching the course of history change. One after another, the most amazing young people stood up and spoke to the world. Students from the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, told us exactly what it was like when a gunman entered their school just 5 weeks earlier on February 14th, Valentine's Day, and slaughtered 17 people, students and teachers. Other young people from other cities spoke about their siblings, their friends, their relatives, all lost to gun violence. Some of the Parkland speakers still bore the physical and emotional wounds. All of them bore psychological wounds from that day. But they were full of passionate conviction that this must never happen again. More than that, it was a conviction that they, a bunch of mostly 17 and 18-year-olds, could be and would be the change they desperately wanted to see. And do you know what? I believed them. I believed them then, and I believe them still. If a dozen or two young people, deep in shock over the invasion of their school, and deep in grief over the loss of fellow students and teachers, in just 5 weeks could pull off a major march on Washington, if they could speak with such passion and maturity and wisdom to a crowd of hundreds of thousands in Washington and millions more around the country and the world, if they could inspire hundreds of simultaneous sibling marches around the country and even abroad, if they could do all of this, then I had to believe that they could do exactly what they said they would do. I had to believe that these kids could achieve what so many people have been trying and failing to do after every mass shooting since Columbine in 1992, to change our nation's gun laws so that no child ever has to be afraid in school again. I can't remember another time in my life when I felt so clearly that I was watching the course of history change in real time, right before my eyes. And so, when I read that email from my colleague, I didn't even have to think about it. I knew that I would say yes, and I knew what my subject would be. Now, I had not lost all sense of reality. I also knew that this night was more than a year away, and all kinds of things could happen in that time. Maybe the movement would fizzle out after the march as the kids settled back into school. Maybe the trolls and the NRA and the big money would win. Maybe when this day came, I would have nothing positive to talk about. I knew all that was possible, but I didn't believe it. What I believed was what I have seen them post on Twitter again and again since then. The young people will win. The young people will win. And for the first time in a long time, certainly for the first time since the start of the current administration in Washington, it felt safe. It felt safe to hope again. And I did. Now, before you decide that I've plunged off the deep end and am trying to drag you in there with me, let me clarify a couple of things. First, no matter how passionate and dedicated the Parkland kids may be, we still live in perilous times. The morning after the 2016 election, I don't know about you, but I awoke to the thought, well, the great American experiment has had a good run, but it's over now. And pretty much every day since then, against my better judgment, I take a peek at the news of the day, and it feels like the whole enterprise has moved one step closer to a black hole from which we will never be able to escape. It's not just gun violence. The intolerance, the denial of science, the hatred, the corruption, the amorality, the ignorance, the spinelessness, and just plain nastiness in the news are just about overwhelming some days. I don't know if you all feel the same way, but I'm guessing many of you do. So I'm emphatically not saying everything is okay. I'm not saying we're out of trouble. I haven't completely lost touch with reality. All I'm saying is, it's starting not to feel totally crazy to hope again. It's starting not to feel totally crazy to hope again. And that, my friends, is no small thing. If you want my message to you tonight in one sentence, that's it. It's starting to feel not totally crazy to hope again. As Jennifer Hudson sang at the end of the March for Our Lives, the times, they are a-changing. And those amazing kids from Parkland are leading the way. The second thing, it proves I'm not crazy, is that great changes in society, even revolutions, are often led by young people. The revolution that founded this nation was led by very young people, at least in part. Maybe because in the pictures, all the men wore those white wigs, we tend to think of the founders of our nation as a bunch of old men. And it's true, there were a few of them in their 60s or even above, though except for Benjamin Franklin, who was 70 in 1776, not the ones whose names we know the best. But get this, in 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, James Monroe, who would later be president, was 18 years old. Andrew Jackson was only 9. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who would be authors of the Federalist Papers just a decade later, were only 21 and 25. Betsy Ross was 24. Even George Washington was only 44. Closer to our own time, some of us here are old enough to have lived through it. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was led largely by the young. It was black college students who first sat in at lunch counters, and largely college students and other young adults risking their lives on the freedom rides. And that's not even to mention the Children's March in Birmingham, or the incredibly brave black teenagers and even preteens who needed armed guards to escort them into white schools that they were taking the first steps to desegregate. Martin Luther King Jr. was only 26 when he led the Montgomery bus boycott. Close on the heels of the civil rights movement, and in fact overlapping it, came the protests against the war in Vietnam, with young people, college students, and young men of draft age at the forefront. One of the catchphrases of that time, some of you remember it, was, don't trust anybody over 30. Leaves me out. The marches, the protests, the organizing of those young people eventually raised up public opinion against the war and were instrumental in bringing it to the end. So, when Parkland kid David Hogg ends his piece, as he does again and again, the young people will win. He's looking to the future, but he has a lot of history behind him. So who are these young people of Parkland, anyway? And how is it that they've caught the imagination of so many people? And how on earth have they been so effective in raising the issues of gun control and school safety when so many other people have been able to make so little headway? First of all, as they often remind us, these are the kids of the school shooting generation. Let that sink in. At 17, 18, and now some of them turning 19 years old, they were all born not long after that first terrible school shooting in Columbine. Just as all of us grew up with regular fire drills in school, and those of us who were old enough grew up with air raid drills, as though hiding under our desks would actually protect us from a nuclear explosion, they've grown up with active shooter drills in their schools. From kindergarten, maybe even pre-K onward, they have grown up with the knowledge that this could happen to them. One of them, Brian Deitch, said in an interview that he hopes someday kids will no longer have to have these regular reminders that they are never 100% safe in school. But at the same time, he said, he was grateful for the drills because knowing what to do certainly saved many lives on that Valentine's Day. Because of this experience, kids this age and younger can speak to this issue with a perspective and an authority that the rest of us only have secondhand. That said, let's acknowledge that this particular group are a bunch of relatively affluent kids, mostly white, cisgender. In some ways, this is a very good thing. Their privilege and their white skin almost certainly drew media attention that probably would never have come to an equally bloody shooting in an inner city black school. But the important thing to note about that is that they are very much aware of their privilege. If you've seen them on TV interviews, you've probably seen that they are very fluent in the language of privilege and oppression. Words like intersectionality, which some of us may be struggling to really get a handle on, just flow easily from their lips. They live that, they know that. That's why the speakers at the March for Our Lives were not just the Parkland kids. Some of the most moving speakers were other young people from other cities. African American kids whose experience with gun violence is not just active shooter drills in their schools, but every day on the streets where they live. There were kids who had lost siblings and cousins and friends, kids who had reason to fear gun violence every day of their lives. When the Parkland kids brought a group from the Peace Warriors in Chicago to visit them in Florida, they were taken aback when one of them remarked on how safe they felt in Parkland, in these kids' homes and neighborhoods, not like theirs. Now, the Parkland organizers had always intended, from the very beginning, that what they were doing was not just a one-off protest. It was the start of a movement. And one important goal from the very beginning was to make sure that their movement was not just about them and kids like them. It had to include the many, many anonymous young people across the country who were generally ignored ignored by the press, but who suffered as much or usually more from gun violence as a simple, ongoing fact of their lives. Well, in some ways, these were just ordinary young people who found themselves in an extraordinary situation. But it's also true, and this is important, that they brought some remarkable skills and talents and training to their efforts. David Hogg, for example, I'm sure you've all seen him on TV or YouTube or something at some point. David Hogg was an experienced member of the debate team. He knew how to make an argument and deliver it persuasively. He was also director of the school's TV network, and he thought of himself as a TV journalist. He was interviewing fellow students and making video while the students and the teachers were still huddled behind desks and in closets. Determined from the start that the students would take charge of their own narrative, he was supplying video and commentary to the professional news people who didn't yet have access to the school or the students. Another one, Cameron Caskey, and a number of others in the group were active in the school's drama program. So they were very comfortable speaking in public, and they knew how to do it effectively. But just as important, they knew how to convey emotion, which would be important in persuading people to their point of view. Jacqueline Corin, Jackie, cheerleader, class president, straight A student, turned out to have amazing organizing skills. She was the one who almost single-handedly organized the bus trip to Tallahassee, the state capital, to lobby the governor and the legislators. She was also the main organizing force behind the Road to Change bus tour last summer, the manager, the scheduler, the briefer, the details person. Most of these kids were already masters of social media. The ones that weren't learned quickly. I'll come back to that point. All of them were the products of a school that encouraged independent thinking and asking questions. In his memoir, David tells us, "We learned so much at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. We studied Supreme Court decisions, read Shakespeare, explored the mysteries of black holes. We spent a huge amount of time on contemporary issues like poverty and environment. In our psychology classes, we talked about grief and death and mental illness. We spent a whole week studying school shootings. But it all seemed a bit distant, a little bit like a dream. Either it happened before we were born, or it was happening somewhere else. When it happened to us, we woke up. We knew we couldn't wait until we got out of college and settled into jobs. We had to make the world a better place now. It was literally a matter of life and death." And of course, there was Emma Gonzales. Her name became a household word just a couple of days after the shooting, when she stood up at a rally in Fort Lauderdale, AP government notes in her hand, to let the world know that the Parkland kids were here to speak the truth to power. Like the little boy in the old story, she spoke up loud and clear to let the world know that the emperor had no clothes on. To a long litany of the reasons why politicians claim nothing can be done to reduce gun violence, to those who insisted that it was too soon to talk about gun reform when people were still grieving, to those who responded with thoughts and prayers and no action, to all of those and more, with tears running down her cheeks, this. Emma called, what did Emma call? You know what Emma called?
BS.
BS. We call BS. The chant of that crowd went viral. I think that was the moment when it became crystal clear that things had changed, that thoughts and prayers wouldn't cut it anymore or ever again. That this was not going to be just another 3-day wonder before everybody settled down and got back to business as usual. To all of that, Emma and her colleagues called BS. And then they got to work. They went about it in some remarkably savvy ways. They realized early on that they needed to have a consistent message to speak with one voice about their goals. So they agreed on a 10-point plan that was aimed at respecting both people's right to own guns and people's right to live. And these goals, they like to point out, are not radical. In fact, they're just really common sense. The goal they mention most often, probably because the polls show that over 90% of Americans support it, is universal background checks for gun purchases, for all gun purchases. The only thing stopping it is politicians enthralled to the National Rifle Association, the NRA, who consistently oppose it. The Parkland kids also want to restore funding for gun violence research and eliminate the absurd restrictions on the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, which, believe it or not, is currently banned by law from keeping a searchable database. They have records of all the gun purchases in the country on paper in the 21st century. The March for Our Lives program emphatically doesn't call for banning all guns, but it does call for banning military-style assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, both of which have been used in, I think, all of the mass shootings. All of the mass shootings. They also want to see funding for intervention programs that have already proved successful at reducing violence. Red flag laws to keep guns away from the people who are at most risk of using them for violent purposes. And laws blocking people with a history of domestic violence from owning guns. Common sense. You can find the details on these, and there were a few other points, at marchforourlives.com if you're interested. Besides these specific goals, they had one more overriding message that all of these depend on, and it was very simple. Vote. If your representatives will not support common sense measures like these, then vote them out and elect people who will. If you're not old enough to vote yet, then get out and help register those who are. They knew the change they wanted would not happen overnight, or even this year. But the way to make it happen, however long it took, was going to be through the ballot box. They had learned in their history classes about popular uprisings of the past, perhaps especially the civil rights movement, and they grounded their movement in Martin Luther King Jr.'s 6 principles of nonviolence, and they reminded each other of them again and again. Keep them right there in front of them. I admit I had to go look them up and see what they were, and you can do that too, because I'm not going to read all 6 of them to you. But they particularly held up the 3rd principle, which in their own words, they kept reminding each other, was like this: the people on the other side are our opponents, but not our enemies. Makes a big difference. Keeping this in mind led them again and again into fruitful conversations with people who started out angry and antagonistic and ended up agreeing on at least some common ground. And when things got tough, and the kids were tempted to be discouraged, they would remind each other again and again of the final principle, which is words familiar to us. The universe is on the side of justice. I think they had that on little medallions they wore. Once they had an idea of where they wanted to go, there was the challenge of getting the word out to as wide an audience as they could. It's the same challenge faced by any social movement. And the successful ones are usually the ones that have mastered the media of their time. We know, for example, that the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s made effective use of the media that were available to them. Above all, television, which was still quite new as a force to shape public opinion. My family got our first TV about 1950. There were stories in the newspapers, of course, but people could ignore those if they wanted to. It was much harder to ignore the images on those little black and white television sets of demonstrators and freedom riders being beaten bloody, of sheriffs with dogs turning fire hoses on small children, of young black children facing a barrage of hateful language as they made their way into their new white schools with armed guards to protect them. Images like these made people see the horrors of segregation in a new way, and that in turn built support for the civil rights legislation. In the same way, the television news films brought the brutality of the Vietnam War into people's living rooms every evening and helped turn the tide of public opinion against the war. The Parkland kids made plenty of use of these now traditional media too, especially in the early days when the story was still fresh. Print journalism cranked out article after article. I have over 100 articles saved on my computer. I will not read them all to you tonight. And that's just from the 4 or 5 papers and magazines that I read at all regularly. They've also published at least 4 books about their experience, in addition to the book Parkland by Dave Cullen, which I commend to you. And the kids were all over TV for a while, usually in 2s and 3s, sometimes more. They were on the news channels, the late night shows, the talk shows. They were even on 60 Minutes. For a while, keeping up with the demand for interviews took just about everybody in the group who was willing to do it. And you can still find a lot of that on YouTube. If you've missed it, you can go back and look for it. But that kind of media attention wasn't going to last forever. Someone asked Matt Deitch, a Parkland alum who was working with the team as their primary research person, what was their strategy for life after media? Oh, said Matt, you mean old media. We've already established our platform. We're on social media. And they were, and they still are. One of the most important things about the Parkland activists has been that they're not only children of the school shooting generation, they're also digital natives. Like many of their generation, they've lived a good chunk of their lives already on social media. Twitter and Snapchat and Facebook and sites I probably haven't even heard of yet were as familiar to most of them as the neighborhoods where they lived, maybe even more so. Facebook, already old-fashioned, was really only for the old folks. That's no longer where the young folks live their lives. So they tweeted, they created memes designed to go viral, they shot lots of short YouTube videos. They made sure they had their facts straight, and then they sent them out with a combination of seriousness, humor, and satire, whatever was appropriate at that moment. They worked as a team, making sure they agreed before sending something out into the world so that their message stayed clear. And they didn't have to be trained to do all this. They were essentially speaking their mother tongue. Now, I've described this so far as a youth movement, and it certainly is that. But there is a critical difference between this and at least some of the youth movements of the past, where the cry of many activists in the 60s was, don't trust anybody over 30. The March for Our Lives leaders knew that they needed the cooperation and help of adults, and they welcomed it, though always on their own terms. From the bus trip to Tallahassee to the March for Our Lives, from the Road to Change bus tour last summer, they needed adults for legal things like bus contracts and hotel reservations. The financial support has largely come from adults because, guess what? They're the ones who have the money. Adults were also very generous in sharing their experience with planning and carrying out mass demonstrations, from logistics to permits to financial arrangements. One adult in particular was very close to them, Manuel Oliver, who was known to the group as Uncle Manny, was the father of Joaquin Oliver, or Guac, one of the slain students, but he's running his own campaign sort of alongside theirs. But always, from the beginning, it's been clear to everybody that the young people were in charge. The adults were there to support and help, but not to take over. And the adults respected that. There are trolls on the internet who would tell you otherwise, but that's how it was. Nowhere was this as clear and dramatic as at the March for Our Lives itself, where the young people decided that where the young leaders decided that the only speakers would be young people. The only adults on that stage were the celebrity musicians who came to support the effort. Otherwise, the kids spoke for themselves. And for all the other children and youth at risk for gun violence on the streets and everywhere. These young voices, one after another, wise, sad, shaky, passionate, thoughtful, and at the very last moment, silent. They were overwhelmingly powerful. They knew what they were doing, these Parkland kids. I don't know how they knew so much, but they did, and they do. It has not all been sweetness and light, of course. We have to remember that especially in those early days, the days and weeks leading up to the march, the Parkland kids were not only planning and tweeting and being interviewed and trying to keep up with their schoolwork, they were also in shock from the attack on their school, attending funerals for their schoolmates and their teachers, grieving the loss of fellow students and teachers. Sleeping and eating, apparently not so much. Moreover, as time went on, some of them suffered from PTSD, others were just plain exhausted. That they could do everything they did is amazing to me. But they supported each other, and they loved each other, and they kept on keeping on, and they somehow pulled it off. And then there were the trolls. There still are, in fact, they're out there. The downside of being on social media is that it could also be used to attack them, and it was. Some of that came direct from the NRA. A lot came from gun owners afraid that the kids wanted to take away everybody's guns. They didn't. And a lot came from just plain nasty people hiding behind the anonymity of the internet. Far from taking it easy on them because they were young. Some people accused them of being too young to know what they were talking about. When, in fact, thanks to Matt and their own other research, the kids generally knew more about the subject than any of their attackers. As David tweeted just recently, if the right wing is so angry about what a 19-year-old is saying, I must be doing something right. The kids weren't really surprised by all this, of course. They know how the internet works. Generally, they gave as good as they got, or better. They handled it all with impressive humor and maturity. They were accused early on, for example, of being crisis actors, people hired to pretend that the school shooting had happened. They found that ridiculous. You've probably seen the tweet Sarah Chadwick posted when people started talking about crisis actors. To clarify, she tweeted, David Hogg can't act to save his life. The fact that some people think he's being paid to is hilarious. When the subject came up in an interview, Brian Deitch just shook his head in wonderment. Some people think crisis actor is an actual job. And in another interview, Cameron Kasky responded by saying, I am an actor. I'm in Spring Awakening, the school play, right now. There's no question that the Parkland kids captured the imagination and the hearts of many Americans, as they certainly did mine. But now, a little over a year later, the question we need to ask is, maybe the one you're asking, have they accomplished anything? Did anything come of it? And I think the answer to that is yes, a clear yes. It's true that we still don't have sensible federal gun control policies. Most of the kids' 10 points are still aspirational. But then they never expected to have the whole thing sorted out by now. And there has been some real progress, if not so much on the federal level, then in many states. The new Democratic majority in Congress did manage to pass a couple of bills, including one significantly expanding the requirement for background checks, though there was never a chance that the bills would be approved by the Senate and signed into law. But state legislatures passed more than 69 gun control measures in 2018, more than any other year since the Newtown, Connecticut massacre in 2012, and more than 3 times the number passed in 2017. And unlike the year after the Newtown shooting, there was a decline rather than a rise in the number of bills expanding access to guns. Now, the Parkland kids were not necessarily responsible for all of that. Much of it was at least in part the result of long, steady work by activist groups working in and out of the spotlight, at least since Newtown, and some longer than that. But at the same time, little of it might have happened without Parkland. An article in the New York Times last December reported 17 students and staff members were killed in the Parkland attack, but it was certainly not the nation's first mass shooting. It is, however, the first one that appears to have been a legislative turning point, a tectonic shift, in the words of Allison Anderman, managing attorney at the Giffords Law Center. A lot of policies we had been working on as a movement for years were pushed across the finish line because of Parkland, she said. Similarly, if we look at voting patterns in the 2018 midterm elections, the kids were working really hard on voter turnout, especially of young voters. If we look at the patterns, there's no way to be exactly sure how much the voter registration drives they did in the Road to Change, how much that affected turnout. But a recent study reported that 36% of students ages 18 to 29 reported voting in last year's midterm elections. That's 16 percentage points more than in 2014 midterm elections, when turnout was 20%, and more than any midterm election since the 1980s. And the youth vote seems to have been decisive in swaying a number of elections across the country. Maybe the Parkland kids can't take all the credit for that. But then again, maybe they can. As Matt Deitch tweeted shortly after the midterms, a group of kids on a living room floor organized the largest protest in American history, a 63-day bus tour, over 200 chapters, registered hundreds of thousands of people, and defeated 27, 3 exclamation points, 27 NRA-backed candidates. I am so proud of all of us, he says. This is the beginning. Besides all that, there have been news reports in recent months that donations to the NRA way down, and even that they may be in serious financial trouble. Apparently, by few young people who are willing to stand up and say out loud that the emperor has no clothes, have emboldened many others to stand up as well. As I've said before, the young activists know they're in it for a long haul. It may take a discouragingly long time to accomplish all their aims. But they know that their lives and the lives of the next generation of children and the next after that are at stake. Emma Gonzales summed it up this way. The movement, she said, is probably going to be years. And at this point, I don't know that I mind. Nothing that's worth it is easy. We're going against the largest gun lobby. We could very well die trying to do this. But we could very well die not trying to do this, too. So why not die for something rather than nothing? She and the others are determined that the movement they are building will be strong and lasting enough to ensure eventually that no child will ever have to experience trauma like theirs. So, what does all this mean for the rest of us, whatever age we are? First thing it means is to take us right back to where I started. It means in the midst of a world and a society that seems to be going to hell in a handbasket in more ways than we can count, these Parkland kids give us reason to hope again. As Bob Dylan sang 50 years ago and Jennifer Hudson sang at the end of the March for Our Lives, the times they are a-changing. These kids believe that at the moment when they stood up and called BS on all the platitudes and defeatism and resistance to change they've lived with all their lives, at the moment when they decided that the massacre at their school was not an ending, but a beginning, the very ground of history shifted. And in that belief, and in that shift, we too can find hope again. But hope is not mindless optimism. It's not a guarantee. It's not a promise. Rather, hope is a challenge. A challenge that Parkland kids and thousands of other kids of their generation have taken up and embraced. Now they challenge us to embrace it as well. If all we do is hope, it's not any better than thoughts and prayers. If all we do is hope, we're letting those kids down big time. As Senator Cory Booker wrote, hope confronts. It does not ignore pain, agony, or injustice. It is not saccharine optimism that refuses to see, face, or grapple with the wretchedness of reality. You can't have active hope without despair, because hope is a response. Hope is the active conviction that despair will never have the last word. And so the hope we may, however tentatively, let ourselves feel today is not just a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's a challenge to act. Like the phoenix rising from its own ashes, hope rises up out of despair and cynicism and carries us into action. It's not just about gun violence. It's also about a climate warming toward irreversible disaster. It's about economic inequality. It's about deep-seated racism, religious extremism, and intolerance. It's about the distortion of democracy by the power of big money. It's about all those issues tearing our society apart and threatening our very future, and especially the futures of our children and grandchildren. And in the end, that's the message of the Parkland kids to all of us adults. We have to act. Just days after the Parkland massacre, David Hogg said to reporters, "We're children. You guys are the adults. You need to take some action." Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager inspired by the Parkland activists who sparked the youth climate marches of recent months, said much the same thing to the wealthy plutocrats gathered in Davos, Switzerland. You say we owe it to the young people to give them hope? I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is. She said, all she wants is for adults to act like adults and act on the terrifying information that is all around us. So that's the challenge to all of us adults. Even those who, like me, may not be around long enough to see either the worst possibilities or the best come to fruition. The times are changing, and there is no more sitting back. We are all called to step up as the Parkland kids have stepped up. And there's also a challenge to the youth, the young adults. We have a few here tonight. There's a challenge for you. I hope that, like Greta Thunberg, you will not only do your own part, but you'll also hold our feet to the fire. Don't let us forget for a moment that it's your lives, your futures at stake, in what we do right now. The old gospel song tells us that the darkest hour is just before dawn. And we are surely living through some very dark times. But the young people have felt the flow of history start to shift between their feet and beneath their feet, and they are on the move. They are determined to be the change they want to see. The challenge to the rest of us, old and young, is simply this. The old order is passing away, and something new is coming into being. Lend a hand or get out of the way. But above all, don't let this moment go to waste, or we may never have another chance.